Hey, A-Pushers. Today is your second lecture of the quarter, chapter 17. We are going to be looking at the Industrial Revolution and the, as they call it here, industrial supremacy. But we're going to be looking at the shifting economy and laissez-faire government of the late early 1900s and how that is going to affect the economic landscape, social landscape, and political landscape of the United States during this time period. So lots to unpack here, and I hope you enjoy. All right, so just to start, we see the GDP, which gross domestic product is GDP. And when we're looking at the gross domestic product, you can see in 2017 over here to the right, Qatar, Luxembourg, Brunei, Ireland is going to have, that's per capita, per person. So in Qatar, the average person is making $128,000, $647, where the United States, the average income is $59,928. Now, there's different factors that play into this, like population and so many other things, but the world average, if we look at this down here, is really quite shocking that the average person worldwide makes $17,100, where that is like well below the poverty line here in the United States, to just kind of put an idea as to what the world's economic situation looks like. But and then in countries like Qatar, we have people making, or Luxembourg, over $100,000 on average per capita per person. Here we see a couple of different other interesting data points. Over here we have non-farm employment by major industry between 1910 and 2015. So you can see the different industries and how diverse the different industries are on this map here. And then over here we have the largest economies, so nominal GDP and the US dollar by trillions, and gross domestic product growth here. Countries like India, China, United States, Japan, Germany are all ones that are going to play into domestic growth. And you can see there's 2.5% GDP growth between 2019 and 2020 here. Okay. So when we go backtrack, and how do we get to this point of growth in the economies, we have to look at the factors that a country must have to industrialize. So England was the first to industrialize, and we do take a lot of the ideas from them and kind of implement their system here in the United States. We try to pick holes in what worked and what doesn't work, and we obviously are going to create our own problems too. So England was the first, and what they had to allow them to industrialize is the list below. So we obviously need population growth. We need both producers and consumers to have an industrial society, because the key to the economic cycle is consumer spending. So we need people producing goods, we need people buying goods in order for a country to become a successful industrial nation. We also need an abundance of raw materials. And if we look at the United States, we obviously have a very diverse landscape. So we have many different climates, many different types of farming and agricultural production, as well as manufacturing, and throughout the entire country have all sorts of different access to raw resources. We have oil, we have coal mining, we have cotton production, we have so many different minerals and lumbering, and access to different water sources, fresh water, salt water. We have transportation as a result of these things. So many different important raw materials. And then what we don't have here in the country, we are going to get from international markets. We need technological innovations. We're going to talk about communication and transportation advancements. We're going to look at the assembly line. We're going to talk about interchangeable parts, machines, and how all these new technologies are going to play into a more efficient world. We need entrepreneurs. These are risk takers in business, somebody who's going to take a risk and start a business. Without risk takers, we are entrepreneurs. We won't see the economic growth that we want. We also won't see the diverse economy that we want. We need a stable a stable government interested in investing in big business. The growth of big business is going to be a huge focus of this chapter. So, we are going to have a stable government, but we also are going to have a government who is practicing laissez-faire policies, where they're going to be very hands-off of regulations of the government. And then lastly, we need large domestic and foreign markets to buy and sell manufactured goods, which is going to help boost our economy. All right, so when we're looking at natural resources and the abundance of raw materials in the United States, we obviously have to talk about both steel and oil. So steel production techniques are going to be improved when we see the creation of what's called the Bessemer process. This was made by Henry Bessemer and improved by William Kelly. What this does is it takes iron ore and it blows out the impurities with heat and allows you to make a stronger steel. And it also creates this process as much faster. So we're going to be producing more steel, which is going to go into the production of many different goods and machines. We call this the Bessemer process. We're going to see Abram S. Hewitt is going to replace the Bessemer process with the open hearth process, which again is going to produce steel in large numbers, and the more that we produce of the good, the more inexpensive it's going to be, and it's going to be more readily available to American businesses. Pittsburgh, it becomes the steel capital, and interesting timing to all my Pittsburgh Steeler fans out there. I'm really sorry about the Sunday night playoff game where the Browns were victorious. I had to get a jab in there to see if we're really listening to these lectures, my Steelers people and Mr. Blaze Steelers people. And the Bengals are already out of it, so sorry also to Mr. Blay. But anyways, in Pittsburgh, there's an abundance of iron ore, so we're going to see a lot of mining taking place where they're going to be extracting the iron ore from the earth. There's already a huge iron industry, so we're going to naturally see that used with the Bessemer process and the open hearth process to produce soft steel for companies to purchase. Every year when we teach this class, it's around the college football playoffs. So, again, interesting timing that Ohio State is going to be playing for the national championship tonight. So go Bucks. I hope that we are able to secure this one from the Alabama Crimson Tide. But anyways, back to the sources of industrial growth. The Pennsylvania Railroad Company created and supplied the Pennsylvania Steel Company. And so they become kind of like a combination industry. So they're able to expand, and they realize now that what they also need to really expand is oil. And we'll see the rise of the petroleum industry as a result. Edwin L. Drake is the first to drill for oil in Titusville, Pennsylvania. He is going to strike oil, what they call it black gold. You can see that up here in this image because it comes out of the ground black, but obviously if you are to strike oil, you're going to become very wealthy as a result. We're able to produce up to 500 barrels of oil in a month, which is a much greater production. And again, the more availability of a good, then the price is going to drop and more people are going to be able to afford the good. So the demand for oil takes off, especially in these three states. So our two of our neighbors, Pennsylvania and West Virginia, are also going to see a huge spike in their oil industry. Okay, so we also, with technological advances, are going to have a huge increase in the modes of transportation. So starting with the automobile and the airplane. The idea kind of started that oil could be used as fuel, or what we know as gasoline, for transportation, and the creation of the internal combustion engine is going to allow for a oil-based engine to be used in a car. Nikolaus Otto from Germany created the first gasoline-powered engine in 1863. Now, we won't see cars really mass-produced until the early 1900s in America, but Gottfried Daimler, another German, creates the first automobile in 1885 that is going to what we know as kind of the Model T. Henry Ford creates the first automobile industry in the U.S. So he doesn't technically create the automobile, but he creates the first mass-produced automobile industry. And, this obviously is going to reshape the entire landscape of the way that we get around throughout the world. We also then have the Wright brothers, Orville and Wilbur Wright. They are from Ohio, and hence why we have the Wright-Patt Air Force Base here in Ohio. They did their first flight, though, in Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, so North Carolina kind of claims the Wright brothers as well, but they're going to, here they are, they're actually all the way up here. They're going to be in the first flight, and it's just interesting to think about. The first flight was in 1903, and we were using airplanes and an Air Force in World War I, which started in 1914, and for some reason that's always hard for me to imagine that planes became that advanced that they could be involved in combat that quickly. Okay, so kind of shifting gears here, we're going to be looking at corporate research and development. So, in order to create new technologies, you need money, and corporations are going to be able to gain the amount of money, raise the amount of money that is needed to, produce these goods. So, companies, they begin to create their own laboratories and hire their own private researchers, and that kind of coincides with the decrease in government funding for these things. The government's going to become much more hands-off, or laissez-faire. There's that term again. And so individual corporations are going to be able to use their own money to do their own research in their labs and hire those researchers. We do start to see kind of a rift between engineers and scientists, kind of creating their own separate spheres. Engineers were much more practical, where scientists were trying to create, discover the unknown, and they we're kind of doing the behind the scenes work, where engineers were trying to apply the science to everyday life, where they can help improve society. We're also going to see a huge transformation in higher education. So we're going to see a lot more people studying a broader range of, I guess, what you would call majors, and going into more specific fields. So, for example, universities, too, start to create their own research centers, like the James Cancer Hospital at Ohio State would be a good example. And a huge part of industrialization is this idea of what we call Taylorism. So Frederick Winslow Taylor decides that we need, with mass production of goods, we need to subdivide tasks. Many of our workers were unskilled, uneducated immigrant workers that were very interchangeable. So we are going to be task-based. Each worker is going to complete one task, and they're going to be able to do it efficiently and quickly. So, it increases, each person is given a task each day, and then the factory has them produce the X amount of goods to kind of meet almost like a quota. So Taylorism is this idea of subdividing tasks. And then if somebody were to get hurt, it was very easy to replace them. Another unskilled worker could jump into the same exact task and complete it with just as much efficiency. So this whole idea of Taylorism is going to create an entirely different type of work in America. And it's going to really put a huge dependency on our unskilled labor force. And then we have old Henry Ford again, who's coming out with what's called the assembly line. So in 1914, we will see the production of assembly lines, and you can see one above there, that these workers here are creating wheels for cars, for automobiles. So, for example, in 1914, with the use of the assembly line, we reduced car production time from 12 and a half hours to 1.5 hours for a single car. An increased production equals a decrease in price. So more Americans are going to be purchasing automobiles. We're going to see more Americans traveling across the country, which means more Americans are going to be buying goods, and there's just going to be more money in circulation. And this kind of plays into that idea of the Gilded Age, because on the surface, more people have more money. In general, we're going to see the overall standard of living rise because of these modern amenities. Also playing into transportation, we're going to see the expansion of the railroad. We are going to see new paths of development throughout the entire nation. Chicago becomes a huge hub for the railroad industry because, as we learned in Chapter 16, the long drives are going to send cattle to the north. They're going to send cattle to Chicago. And then once they get to Chicago, the meatpacking industry was a huge lucrative industry. That's where they went to slaughter. So a lot of different trains ran through Chicago, but we're going to see the standardization of railroad tracks where they all are the same width. We're also going to see the creation of time zones in 1913. And time zones are really going to help with organizing departure times and arrival times and figuring out when goods need to be dropped off, when goods need to be picked up, and kind of maximizing production of transportation. So in 1860, for example, the year that the Civil War started, we had 30,000 miles of track in the United States. By 1900, just 40 years later, we have 193,000 miles of track throughout the United States. So the movement of goods is happening, and it's happening quick. The railroad industry does begin to be controlled by specific individuals. We're going to see some people really capitalize on this industry, which is going to be kind of create some issues down the road that we'll talk about. But Cornelius Vanderbilt famously is going to be a tycoon of the railroad industry, James Hill and Collis Huntington. But we'll come back to Vanderbilt. He was one of our major tycoons throughout this time period. Okay. So yeah, here you can see the major railroads in 1870s compared to the 1890s with the red additional, and then the Transcontinental Railroad is here that connects in Omaha but then spreads out throughout the entire country. Okay. So this slide is super important. There's a lot of really key ideas here. We have vertical and horizontal integration, also talking about limited liability. You never know how hard it is to write a word that you're not saying until you actually try that. So anyways, corporations begin to sell stock in order to become richer and expand their production. So, we call those shares, and you can do this. If you want to be a day trader, you can be a day trader and invest your money into different companies that you trust. And the general public can buy shares of stocks, and then you share in the profits. Like, for example, I know quite a few of my friends that are day traders, and they take money every once in a while, and they invest it into companies, and they watch the stock market, and they buy and sell when prices are good. Now, here's why this is okay, and here's why you're protected when you do this, is because of something called limited liability. Limited liability is basically saying that whatever amount of money that you put into the company, you're only held responsible for that amount of money, even though you are a technical owner in the company. So, for example, if I were to invest $1,000 into the company, I can't lose more than what I've invested. So it's going to give people the incentive to invest their money because they're going to be protected. We also are going to see some new types of businesses forming in the corporation world. For example, Andrew Carnegie, he is going to use horizontal integration to buy out all of his competition. He uses vertical. So he buys out all of the factors of production. So he doesn't just buy out all the other steel industries, but he buys out every piece of the production process. So he buys cattle, he buys the slaughterhouse, he then buys the refrigerated railroad cars in the cooled warehouses, he then buys the meatpacking plant. So he has control of prices on all of these different factors of production. Where Rockefeller and some of the other tycoons go a different route of horizontal integration, where instead of buying out the factors of production, they're going to buy out all of their competition, and they're going to be able to set prices in the market. Now, a lot of these famous guys like Rockefeller and Carnegie are ultimately going to be doing both vertical and horizontal integration of kind of like a combination. And that's how they're going to be able to get so unbelievably wealthy. We're also going to see new managerial techniques taking root. So we have new divisions of responsibility. We have new roles of leadership within factories. There's kind of this middle manager guy who you have the tycoon who owns the business, and then you have the middle manager who might manage the factory, and then you have the workers. And there's these different levels of hierarchy being implemented into these corporations where different people have different power and different amounts of money. Here you can see kind of some of the vertical and horizontal integration that's taking place in this different levels of different levels of integration and management. Okay, so we're going to start here looking at captains of industry versus robber barons. And these are two terms that'll be really good to know for this unit. So some of our big tycoons that can be called either captains of industry or robber barons are Andrew Carnegie, Cornelius Vanderbilt, J.P. Morgan, and John D. Rockefeller. The difference between a captain of industry and a robber baron is how you view the role of these people in society. So if you take Cornelius Vanderbilt, for example, he has bought out a majority of the railroad industry as well as the factors of production for the railroad industry. So he is incredibly wealthy. And he is corrupt in some of his business practices. He's looking out for number one and doing what he can to make as much money as possible, even if it's not always fair to the most people. Now, here's the thing. He also is going to take his money, and that would be a robber baron. That they're using unfair, corrupt business practices to expand their wealth. But then you can also call him a captain of industry because A, he's expanding the railroad industry. He's expanding the transportation industry. He's making money for the country by improving the speed of transportation. He also is philanthropic, just like Andrew Carnegie, John D. Rockefeller, and J.P. Morgan. They're doing things like creating colleges and universities and libraries and parks and music halls and museums that are going to provide for the people. So these guys, even though they could be corrupt, they paid their workers terribly. They bought out the competition. They ruined the idea of having a ma and pa shop. But they allowed the economy to expand, and they provided philanthropic resources for the people living near them or people who are interested in taking part in these opportunities. So, to decide that they're a captain of industry is seeing these men as a positive light and a robber baron in a negative light. Okay, so going back to integration and consolidating corporate America, we have two different types of integration, but the goal of creating a monopoly is to eliminate the competition so that you can set your own prices, your own wages, your own everything that goes into your business, you can control. So, for example, horizontal integration is when you buy out the entire industry by consolidating all of the light competition. So you're buying out all of the railroad companies and creating one single railroad company in a monopoly. Where vertical integration, as we looked at a couple slides ago, is when you're buying out all of the factors of production. So you don't have to pay an absurd price for a refrigerated car because you own that company and you're going to set the price where it works for you. So a lot of these big tycoons, though, used both. They not only bought out all of their competition, but they also bought out their factors of production. So they had complete control of their industry and their companies. For example, Standard Oil, Rockefeller Standard Oil, was broke up by the federal government in 1911, but for years was extremely successful in buying out 90% of the refined oil in the United States. Rockefeller is going to become one of the leaders of monopolies in the country throughout the late 18 and early 1900s. So on another note, we're looking at trusts and holding companies. So a trust is an economic combination. First it was used by Rockefeller, where you're using both vertical and horizontal integration, and then you have the continuation of J.P. Morgan, who is going to expand his industry exponentially. So a trust agreement is when stockholders transfer from individual corporate stock to a group of trustees in exchange for a share in trust. It allows a very few number of people to run many corporations. However, they don't have any pull in economic decision making. They're just kind of there to collect profit. So you're a shareholder. A holding company forms as a result to protect these companies, these corporate combinations. So what a holding company is it's a central body that buys up the stock of the trust members and buys them out. So for example, if Rockefeller wanted to buy out another oil company, he would have to use the holding company that would buy out over 50% of the company he's buying out, and then it would technically just then become part of or a combination with the Standard Oil Company and would become his. So there's a lot of good things with rapid economic growth, but there's also some bad things too. So 1% of corporations in the United States controlled 33% of manufacturing, meaning that private ownership was very limited beyond these guys. Now the question begs, what was it good or bad that a very small number of people owned a majority of the business in America? I'll let you think about that, but, try to come up with both pros and cons for that situation. Okay, so
here is part 2.
Shifting gears again, we're going to be looking now at the critics of capitalism,
broken up into 2, but
and capitalism
being
itself.
my normal self, got distracted and forgot to finish what I had started. So, we're going to pick up with the critics of capitalism and people who were leaning more towards, ideologies of both like more socialism, and then we have the ideas of like social Darwinism that we're going to see play into like eventually what would become more of like a fascist idea. So, what's kind of driving this idea is individualism, and this idea that individuals can expand themselves through their own personal hard work. And so, this idea that you've earned your own money and you should be able to use your money how you want and how you please, and that's considered the idea of the self-made man. So it's considered, though, the myth of the self-made man, because there's very few true rags to riches stories where somebody is born into poverty and is able to work their way up to becoming, as someone as high up as Carnegie or Rockefeller. But, this claim is that, Protestant America values hard work and that their people's thrift and acquisitiveness and their tactfulness in business is what helps make them rich. But the reality of these wealthy people is that most of them were born wealthy. And they used, these business practices of business combinations and integration and buying out entire industries and paying off politicians and corrupt business practices to ruthlessly rise to the top rather than, honestly earning these livings. So, this idea of the self-made man was kind of a myth because most people were starting with a little bit of money in their pocket, if not a lot of money. Now, in comes the idea of survival of the fittest and social Darwinism. And social Darwinism is an idea or ideology created by Herbert Spencer based off of Charles Darwin's ideas of the laws of evolution and survival of the fittest. So this is kind of applied to the economic and social fabrics of America or of the world, of people in general. That, Charles Darwin's ideas of evolution do influence the idea that the fittest individuals will be the most fit to survive in the marketplace. And if you're unfit, you're going to be, an unskilled worker in a factory. And that's just kind of where you belong. Unfortunately, this kind of creates the divide between social classes and this idea that society would benefit from the unfit being eliminated or, kept in these lower social rungs of society, whether it's, in a factory or, in some sort of menial position. We also see the idea of the invisible hand, and this comes from an economist named Adam Smith. And he's considered the father of modern capitalism. And what Adam Smith believed is that the American economy progresses not by government intervention and labor unions, but by competition and supply and demand. What he says is that, supply and demand will naturally decide the price of goods and how much is produced. We don't need the government to decide that. So, people are naturally going to be demanding X amount of goods, and then businesses will then respond to that level of demand, and they'll create that number. And then we have, this idea of competition, is that because competition is going to drive down prices, that it will keep the prices to be true. Now, obviously, competition is eliminated when monopolies take over the market and monopolies aren't controlled by the government. So there's a lot of moving pieces to these ideas. So then this more social idea is going to be the gospel of wealth. So this is the idea that these great tycoons, these industrialists, should not just build their trust funds, but take some of that money that they have and incorporate it back into society. So provide for the community. So take some of their fortunes and put it back into helping those that are less fortunate than them. whether it's building schools, libraries, institutions. And that's when you think of things like Rockefeller Center and Carnegie Hall and Carnegie Mellon and Vanderbilt University, where these, in this case, captains of industry were more philanthropic with their money and giving back, even though they were still using, corrupt business practices. Some other examples is your Acres of Diamonds. This is by Russell Conwell. He believed that everyone has a diamond in their backyard. Everyone has an equal chance of becoming a millionaire as long as you use your thriftiness, your smarts, your ability to rise, and we all are from an equal opportunity, if you will. And then we have other authors like Horatio Alger, who wrote Rags to Riches stories, and you can see some of the books down there in the corner. And they become very common and give kind of motivation to the common man of, you know what, if I can do this, I can work hard and earn a living and become, a successful person in society. So, another important figure. Okay, so continuing on to some of the other alternative visions for the American economy, we're going to see some very different variety of ideas, like Lester Frank Ward, who supports the idea of intervention in positive economic planning. So basically allowing the government to participate in economic planning. And people could basically, this is what we see today. People could vote for their representatives, who then in turn create economic plans tailored to their needs. And if we look at the House of Representatives, they are going to be, running for their constituents and trying to create a situation where they're going to do economically what's best for those who live in their districts and things like that. Anyways, the other idea here is Daniel De Leon, who created a socialist group that supported organized labor and a more hands-on government. This is going to be just basically more government regulations, and these are going to be ideas that are implemented throughout the progressive era that we'll learn about later on in Unit 6. Henry George wrote a book, Progress in Poverty, in 1879, which what his idea is to create one single tax on all the land, and wealthy landowners would pay the most. And this could help to destroy any monopolies, as they would have to take their money and redistribute it for all the land. And then lastly, we have Edward Bellamy, who created interestingly enough, a book based in the future in the year 2000. Jonas Brothers reference there, if you're a Joe Bro fan. So one single trust formed out of all of the monopolies, and it was controlled by the government. So this would be more of a command economy-like situation, where the government would then control all of the business and divide its assets equally. So of course, this is really what we see in the Soviet Union, or the goal of the Soviet Union later on in the 1920s and 30s. So some of the problems that are attached to a monopoly, or the system of monopolies, is that monopolies can be blamed for artificially high prices. And the reason that monopolies can charge artificially high prices is because there is no competition. And when there's no competition, if this is a need, a necessity of something like gasoline or oil, you have to buy the oil. So if you can only have one oil company, then you're forced to pay those prices. It also creates a very unstable economy, because you put all of your eggs in one basket. If that one company or one business goes under or starts to fail or do poorly, then there's no other companies to kind of be there to back it up. And then it also takes away the ability to become a self-made man. That's supposed to say ability. And that's in the sense of that there's no small businesses, there's no mom and pop shops that are going to rise up, because everybody is functioning more you can't compete. So there are not a lot of small businesses, not a lot of entrepreneurs present in a system with monopolies. As a result of monopolies, we see 80% of Americans living modestly, and 10 million were living at or below the poverty line. So 76 million people are living at or below the poverty line in 1900 in the United States. The next bullet point is quite alarming, that 1% of the population controlled 88% of all the nation's assets. So this is that this distribution of wealth, this problem that is very, very dire. Overall, the Industrial Revolution did result in the overall improved standard of living, though. We talk about the Gilded Age and that gold layer over the corruption. So, this is what people see when they come to America, is this beautiful place to live with opportunity and many jobs and, middle-class living and upper-class living. But, despite what they see on the surface, there are 76 million Americans living at or below the poverty line in 1900. And there's this huge gap between the rich and the poor that only continues to grow. When we look at industrial workers in the new economy, we are obviously going to see a large number of the workers that are immigrants. So we do see farmers moving to cities because, we see a lot of commercial farming taking over small farms, as well as people wanting access to more goods and services and, not having access to good farming land. But when we shift, so there is some internal migrations, but most workers are coming as immigrants. So people are now coming from all over Europe, not just Western Europe. We're going to see people coming from Southern and Eastern Europe, like Italy, and we'll also see over 1 million Mexicans on the West Coast coming from Mexico. Especially when the Chinese Exclusion Act is put into place, the Mexican-American population is going to fill in those gaps. The Chinese Exclusion Act lasted from 1882 till 1943. The same push and pull factors are kind of present from what we've learned. It's a continuity. But, as far as new opportunity and these kind of empty promises of, if you come to America, you're going to have a job forever and you're going to be so happy, didn't always hold true. We see a lot of propaganda used to bring people to the United States, but sometimes their situations didn't pan out just like they did in the brochure. We are also going to see, as more immigrants move to the United States, we're going to see more ethnic tensions rising as the diversity rises. When one group was actively working for lower wages, they oftentimes tensions would rise. I do want to bring the attention to Angel Island in the top there. This similar to Ellis Island in New York. This was the immigration station where all workers were, screened to make sure that they were free of disease and, capable of moving into the new United States. All right, so a lot of this stuff is pretty self-explanatory on the next couple of slides. Being in the working class during the Industrial Revolution was just simply not good. The average annual income for an American in 1900 was $400 to $500. That's annual income. That's how much money they're making in the entire year. Wow. I was just reading today that, people are looking at increasing the minimum wage to $15 an hour. So, this is, obviously inflation plays into this, but the wages were just incredibly low. We're also going to see very low job security. When companies were booming, they hired. When things weren't doing good, they got rid of you without any sort of hesitation, even really. Many lost jobs to technology. They were replaced, especially skilled artisans. They're replaced by machines, and they have to find new jobs to take. There's a lot of monotony and repetition. When you're working 14-hour days in a factory and doing the same task all day long, you are going to be exhausted, and you are not going to be able to perform at your top level with working a 12-hour shift. There was also very dangerous working conditions without compensation, workers' comp for injury. Many people would work 10 to 12-hour days, again, with very low pay. And, as we see this loss of control that is listed down here, industrial workers really lose control over their own grievances in the sense of they lost their voice and they had to, form labor unions to really get this back, this voice back, and to get control of the issues that they saw, just like wages and hours and conditions. Here's some images from the Industrial Revolution. I'll allow you to pause and look through these. Okay, as far as women go, women were paid very poorly, even even less than men. Women had to join the workforce because single women were supporting their families or that the family needed two incomes. Women typically worked in factories or in textile mills, as well as domestic servants, especially in cities. Women got about half the wages of men, usually earning on average $300 a year. We also see child labor expanding, even though it shouldn't be. But people needed their families to, they needed their kids to work. And oftentimes they went to work instead of to school, and that's just really alarming. Labor laws were exempted in agricultural jobs, and in factories, they simply just limited the age to 12. So instead of going to school at age 12, they're working in factories for 12 hours a day. Okay, so kind of shifting gears here to the unions and strikes. I really want to focus on the difference between the Knights of Labor and the AFL, but we'll of course mention, the National Labor Union was one of the first attempts at a national labor union of people across the country. We see the Molly Maguires as well. These were coal miners, mostly from Ireland. It was a militant labor organization that when they didn't get what they wanted, they turned to assassinations. And I think they killed somewhere around 24 people in their fight to gain more power. The Great Railroad Strike, I'm just going to kind of breeze over this because people studied this in their jigsaw, but this began in West Virginia and spread throughout the Midwest. It began with a 10% wage cut. Of course, these workers were upset. Riots broke out across the entire eastern part of the United States. People were boycotting driving trains, and state militias had to be brought in. Throughout this long dispute, 100 people approximately were killed. Now we have the Knights of Labor. This is one of the first national labor unions. The important part to remember about the Knights of Labor is that they accepted all. They accepted women, they accepted minorities, they accepted skilled and unskilled workers. So this was a much broader labor union than the AFL, which we'll learn about here in a second. They wanted long-range reform. They wanted, federal laws put into place to ensure their workers' safety and quality of time spent. Now, there was disillusion of the Knights of Labor after the Haymarket Square riot, where police officers were killed. So, that was going to be the demise of their group. We also have the AFL, which is the American Federation of Labor. The AFL is going to be a skilled labor union. This was a craft union. They did not allow women or minorities to join, and their agenda was better pay and working conditions. They wanted collective bargaining, which allows for the management to bargain with the union leaders to create change, and they also supported the process of striking. The AFL was present at the Haymarket Square riot, and this, led to the deaths of, I think, upwards of 10 people when a bomb was thrown into a crowd of protesters in Chicago. So this was a very dire situation. You can see the painting down there in the corner. The Homestead strike is one that is super important because this one used what's called strike breakers, or in this case, they were called Pinkerton. So when the workers went on strike, they actually just hired new people to take their jobs, which, basically made their positions against the company irrelevant. So as a result of this, the amalgamated union was destroyed, and the continued trend of decreasing union support was being seen, that less and less people were trusting unions, and they looked at them as radical and extreme and dangerous. And then the Pullman strike, this one, the Pullman cars, this one again is in Illinois. Eugene V. Debs was the leader of the American Railway Union here. There was a 25% wage cut, but no increase or decrease in the rent. So people were having to pay the same amount of money for rent, but they weren't getting any amount of extra cash. Some of the sources of labor weakness, we're going to see immigration and worker mobility increase. So basically, as we see just more and more immigrants filtering in and filtering out, it's going to be harder to organize. There's some social mobility. People are going to climb the ladder over time, but most remain part of the working class. The corporate strength is going to, it's going to damage the new economy. Unions could not compete with the strength of the corporations and businesses, and they definitely fueled. Most local, state, and federal actions backed the management, and that was never a good situation. So thanks for listening, and we'll see you when we see you.